The Saint Denis orphanage in New Orleans had always carried a weight, a lingering humidity that clung to its walls and wood, mingling with the sharp antiseptic smell of disinfectant that never fully masked the rot of age. On that late summer afternoon, the heavy doors creaked open to admit a child no one expected, no one had requested, a small figure whose presence seemed to draw the stale air inward, pausing as though the house itself held its breath. She was 7, pale as linen washed in moonlight, frail but deliberate in her movements. Her hair fell in loose strands, almost silver in the fading sun, and her eyes, wide and dark, observed everything. Every whisper among the staff, every scurry of a mouse or twitch of a shadow, she catalogued without expression, absorbing and processing in a way that made those around her uneasy. The other children, accustomed to the eerie quiet that pervaded Saint-Denis, felt the difference immediately. The cats hissed and slipped into corners, tails lashing at empty air. Dogs turned away, noses twitching at an invisible taint, leaving the child to pass unhindered. No one could explain why the animals recoiled. The matron, Madame Rousseau, eyed the girl warily as she stepped across the polished, worn floorboards, her small shoes making barely a sound. She carried no belongings, no papers, no hint of family. Whispers fluttered between the caretakers like shadows in the hall. Where had she come from? Why had she arrived alone? The child did not answer. She did not speak at all, moving with a quiet precision, her gaze sweeping corridors and rooms as though measuring them, noting the faint discoloration of the wallpaper, the uneven tilt of the ceiling beams, the slight creak of floorboards under invisible weight. When Madame Rousseau gently reached for her arm to guide her into the nursery, her hand met a chill so unnatural that she recoiled, murmuring to herself about drafts in the old building. The child's skin was cool, cold even, and beneath the surface, at her wrists and along the hollow of her neck, there was a subtle bluish tint, faint but persistent, as if her blood carried secrets the world could not yet read. Candlelight would later make the hue seem almost supernatural, the color of twilight pressed under skin. The nurse, Sister Clémence, insisted on measuring the child's pulse immediately, her hands trembling as they searched for the familiar thrum of life. She found something that made her put aside her professionalism in quiet awe and mounting unease. The pulse was slow, deliberate, like a metronome ticking beneath porcelain skin, and the extremities remained cold despite the sweltering air. Repeated measurements confirmed it, and she began recording them obsessively, noting each anomaly with increasing dread. Each jot of ink onto the ledger seemed to echo in the empty corridors. The child's vitals defied explanation, and Sister Clémence could feel in the way the hairs rose at the back of her neck that this was no ordinary child. Celeste, as she was quietly named, accepted the attention with a calm that was unnerving. She did not cry when hands prodded her, did not resist when eyes scrutinized her skin, and in her silence she appeared to understand every thought, every question that lingered behind the measured words of the staff. In the nursery she stood apart, always observing, her head tilting slightly as if catching sounds and movements that others missed entirely. The children, once curious, kept their distance. Some whispered of her oddness, of the strange blue that appeared and disappeared in her skin. Some dared to touch her hand, recoiling at its ice-cold grip. She remained untouchable in that sense, a quiet presence that unnerved and fascinated in equal measure. Even the house itself seemed to respond. The damp wood moaned under her step. Shadows seemed to gather more densely in corners she passed, and the faint whisper of wind through broken panes carried an almost imperceptible resonance, as though the building itself acknowledged the intrusion of something beyond its understanding. Caretakers speculated wildly about her origins, tracing rumors that swirled in the streets outside, but nothing fit, and no one came forward to claim her. In the midst of speculation and fear, one truth became undeniable. Celeste was unlike any child they had encountered, a presence that bent the ordinary into uncertainty. In her quiet, calculating observation, she revealed the first hint of the anomaly that would haunt Saint-Denis, a latent dread that curled in the stomachs of all who lived within the ancient walls. The pale child had arrived, and with her the air of the house shifted, taut as a string ready to snap. In that moment, science, superstition, and fear collided silently, laying the foundation for the horrors that would follow. Dr. Auguste Lemoine was a man known for precision, for order, and for a reputation that stretched beyond New Orleans as one of the few physicians who could balance the cold calculus of science with the delicate rhythms of human care. Yet when he first set eyes on Celeste, he did not recoil. Where others saw pale fragility, he saw anomalies, patterns, and questions no book could answer. He was drawn to her in a way that made even the most skeptical nurses uneasy, moving with quiet purpose toward her, his fingers itching to measure, to probe, to understand. At first, his fascination appeared clinical, a professional curiosity. But behind his measured gestures lurked a subtle, hidden darkness, a thrill in controlling, observing, and orchestrating life with deliberate care. Lemoine began his observations in daylight, noting the irregularities with detached attention. Her pulse remained slow and steady, almost imperceptible, her extremities unresponsive to warmth, her veins showing a faint, unnatural blue beneath translucent skin. He tapped lightly on her wrists, pressed a thermometer to her forehead, and measured every minute response with meticulous care. Each reading only deepened his curiosity. Then, when the world slept and the corridors of Saint-Denis fell into shadowed silence, he began his secret experiments. The nights became a theater of study. Lemoine prepared small instruments with mechanical precision, levers and weights designed to apply minor pressure, delicate tubing for measuring responses to heat and cold, thin wires that delivered controlled, nearly imperceptible shocks. Every detail was recorded, each reaction noted with ink and hand. Celeste did not flinch. She did not cry or protest. In fact, she seemed to anticipate each action, her dark eyes following his every movement with a calm that unsettled him. Sometimes, when a clamp was applied or a tiny spark traced her skin, she would tilt her head slightly, subtly adjusting the angle of her limb, almost guiding him toward an effect she alone seemed to comprehend. Lemoine, aware of the uncanny intelligence in her gaze, began to feel a deeper, almost ritualistic satisfaction in the procedures. His science blurred with obsession. The line between study and control began to fade. He collected samples with the precision of a man who feared contamination not only of matter but of the mind. Drops of blood swabbed and preserved were catalogued under candlelight. Lemoine began to sketch diagrams around his notes, circles, lines, and markings that resembled symbols more than anatomical references. At first, they were scientific attempts to map reactions, but soon he found himself drawing them with a reverence and ritualistic care that mirrored the careful handling of his instruments. The act of measuring, observing, and recording became a nightly devotion, a slow ceremony of discovery that existed somewhere between methodical inquiry and the beginnings of cruelty masked as science. His obsession deepened when he noticed subtle changes in Celeste during the procedures. Her breathing, shallow and measured, seemed to synchronize with his own, and her pupils tracked with a precision that suggested she understood more than the human mind should allow. Lemoyne theorized about chemical anomalies in her blood, traces of unknown elements, patterns of response that defied the accepted science of the time. And as he catalogued every abnormality, he felt an exhilarating sense of control, the power to coax life into revealing its hidden mechanisms, to test boundaries with a detachment that others might call inhuman. Outside the laboratory of his night observations, Celeste remained outwardly innocent, a quiet child among the wards. Staff noticed no change in her demeanor, yet they felt the same cold shiver in the hallways that had accompanied her arrival. Lemoyne alone understood that her compliance was not submission but something far more complex, a partnership of perception. She was both subject and silent collaborator, and in this quiet recognition he found a satisfaction that went beyond science. His curiosity had metastasized into something darker, more profound. The thrill was no longer in understanding, but in orchestrating, manipulating, and observing responses with absolute precision. Even as he documented the night's work in his journals, ink smudged with sweat and candle smoke, a subtle transformation occurred in Lemoyne himself. The pursuit of knowledge gave way to obsession. Scientific rigor became ritual. Every measurement, every reaction, every subtle twitch of Celeste's fingers or contraction of her pupils was a note in a symphony of control that only he could conduct. In his mind, the world contracted to the room, the instruments, and the child who understood far too much. And in that quiet, measured darkness, the first seeds of methodical evil took root, a careful, deliberate cultivation of dominance cloaked in the language of science, waiting to bloom into the horrors yet to come. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the orphanage itself was holding its breath, waiting for the darkness to claim its first victims. At first it was small things. A coat missing from a hook, a slipper left in the hallway, a whispered name unanswered at roll call. Then one night Emily, a bright-eyed girl of 8 with hair the color of honey, did not return to her bed. Her blanket lay twisted, damp from night sweats, and a faint smear of what might have been blood trailed to the edge of the wooden floor, ending abruptly as if she had been lifted away. The caretakers were at a loss. They searched every corridor, checked every locked room, but Emily had vanished without a trace. Whispers passed through the halls like smoke, curling into the ears of children too young to articulate their fear. Soon after, Lucien, a boy with a stutter and a habit of humming softly under his breath, disappeared in the same manner. He was last seen running to the washroom only to never return. His cot was empty, his small shoes neatly placed beneath it, and a thin line of moisture led toward the kitchen, where the smell of disinfectant could not erase the hint of iron in the air. The staff began to murmur among themselves, fear lacing every word. The older children clung to one another, eyes wide, ears straining at every creak and sigh of the decaying building. But Celeste was untouched. She moved through the orphanage with the same quiet grace, pale blue hands folded, her dark eyes observing without judgment. She was there in the room when Lucian vanished, yet she neither screamed nor reached for help. Her presence a cold, calm counterpoint to the panic around her. Dr. Lemoyne watched these events with a mixture of fascination and calculation. He did not intervene. He allowed the disappearances to unfold as data points, each one a new variable in a pattern only he could read. His notebooks filled with meticulous records, the conditions before each child vanished, the time of night, the lighting, the temperature, the subtle tremors in the remaining children's bodies. He noted the reactions of the caretakers, their hurried footsteps and whispered concerns, cataloging every human response as if it were a chemical reaction, a test to be repeated and refined. In Lemoyne's mind, Celeste was no longer just a subject. She was a catalyst, the central figure in a growing laboratory of fear and observation. Marianne, the young caretaker who had begun to notice the unnatural patterns, started keeping watch at night, hiding in darkened hallways following the faint sounds of movement. She glimpsed shadows slipping along the walls, heard the soft padding of bare feet, and caught glimpses of Celeste standing in doorways, her small frame still almost statuesque, watching the corridors as if she alone knew the rules of the dark. Marianne tried to warn the others, but their disbelief and exhaustion made her reports seem like the delusions of a tired mind. The fear she felt was personal and growing, a creeping terror that mirrored the helplessness of the children she tried to protect. The orphanage itself seemed to respond to the tension, the wooden beams groaning under humidity, the flickering candlelight casting shapes that mimicked the absent children, and the air thick with the mingled scents of disinfectant, sweat, and a faint metallic trace that no one could place. Nighttime became unbearable. Doors once trusted as boundaries felt porous, walls seemed thinner, and shadows moved with a sentience that left both children and adults unsettled. The disappearances were methodical, precise, almost surgical in their absence. Nothing was destroyed, nothing was overturned. Only the children themselves were gone, leaving behind the echo of their lives and the haunting impression that someone or something had walked silently among them, choosing who would remain and who would vanish. And always Celeste was present. She moved through the orphanage with a calm that was unnerving, her eyes absorbing every detail, every reaction, every flicker of fear. She never spoke, never offered consolation, but neither did she provoke. It was as if she understood the rules of this unseen game, as if the disappearances themselves were an experiment in which she was both subject and observer, her presence a subtle manipulation of the environment around her. Lemoyne's obsession deepened. The vanishing children became data, the fear a medium, and Celeste, the pale girl with blue blood, the nexus through which all observation and control flowed. By the time Sophie disappeared, leaving behind only the faint shimmer of her nightgown and the echo of a frightened cry muffled by walls, the orphanage had become a labyrinth of paranoia. The remaining children whispered in corners, shadows and candlelight intertwining, suspicion and fear carving lines into young faces. The staff no longer questioned the quiet. They only moved cautiously, aware that the building itself seemed to harbor secrets it would not disclose. And in the center of it all, calm and pale, Celeste observed her blue-veined wrists gleaming faintly in the dim light, a silent and unnerving witness to the orchestrated chaos, the living heart of a darkness no one yet fully understood. The discovery began with curiosity, a mixture of scientific fascination and a shadow of dread. Lemoyne prepared a small, secluded room at the far end of the orphanage, its walls lined with worn wood and cabinets filled with glass vials, rusted instruments, and the faint, lingering scent of antiseptic. Candlelight trembled against the walls, casting flickers that danced like silent witnesses. Celeste sat perfectly still on the wooden chair in the center, her hands folded in her lap, pale skin glowing faintly under the soft light. The nurse had restrained her as politely as possible, though restraint was unnecessary. Celeste did not flinch, did not resist, her dark eyes fixed on the instruments as though she already knew their purpose. Lemoyne's hands were steady, gloves barely trembling as he cleaned the small puncture site on her wrist. He murmured to himself, recording observations in his notebook. Pulse slower than any normal child, extremities icy, heart rhythm almost imperceptible under his instruments. Then carefully, deliberately, he inserted the needle. The blood that emerged was like liquid metal, a dense, deep blue that shimmered under candlelight. It pooled slowly, impossibly vivid, darker than lapis lazuli, almost iridescent. For a moment, Lemoyne froze, breath caught between scientific awe and a rising sense of unease. He repeated the draw, confirmed the consistency, and each time the same startling, unnatural color appeared. The blue blood did not foam, did not clot as normal blood would. It remained smooth, undisturbed, as if it defied the very laws of human physiology. Celeste watched silently, a faint upward curl at the corner of her lips as if she had anticipated this revelation. She did not flinch at the needle, nor at the strange instruments Lemoyne used to test her blood. Glass slides, temperature probes, small chemical reactions that would have caused any other child to scream. She seemed to understand the experiment as intimately as Lemoyne himself, her calmness amplifying the room's tension, a quiet assertion of control over the scene. Lemoyne scribbled notes feverishly, describing viscosity, temperature reactions, and the impossibility of chemical analysis. Every conventional test failed. Reagents changed color, evaporated, or reacted violently in ways that science could not predict. He tried every formula he knew, sent samples to nearby physicians and chemists, and each returned letter carried dismissal, confusion, or polite disbelief. Yet in his isolation, Lemoyne did not falter. His obsession deepened. He began to draw diagrams in the margins of his notebooks, intricate patterns of circles, lines, and symbols that resembled the occult more than science. But he told himself they were merely visual aids, attempts to understand the structure and purpose of Celeste's blood. He measured her responses to light, sound, and slight temperature changes, recording subtle pupil contractions, shifts in breathing, and the faint rise and fall of her chest. Each observation was catalogued as a miracle of physiology or an anomaly beyond explanation, and with each page, Lemoyne's obsession grew more personal, more ritualistic. The local medical community dismissed him outright. Letters arrived, some polite, others scornful, accusing him of hysteria, of overactive imagination, of seeing patterns that did not exist. Lemoyne filed the letters carefully, noting each as evidence of the world's inability to comprehend true discovery. He no longer sought validation. He sought understanding, control, and ultimately completion. Every session with Celeste became more precise, more orchestrated, and the blue blood was no longer a curiosity. It was a key, a portal into possibilities that few dared consider. And yet Celeste's role remained enigmatic. She did not resist. She watched, absorbed, and sometimes responded with subtle movements. A slight tilt of her head, a shift in posture, a blink at precise moments that seemed to guide the experiment without word or gesture. It was as though she was not only participating but influencing the outcomes, an accomplice in her own study. Lemoyne felt it, the quiet manipulation, the unspoken understanding that she was more than a patient, more than a subject. She was an enigma, a child who contained the extraordinary within the ordinary, whose very presence challenged the natural laws he thought he knew. By the end of the night, Lemoyne's notebooks were filled with observations, charts, and sketches. The blue blood shimmered in the vials, calm and unyielding, and Celeste returned to her cot, pale and unreadable, while the candlelight flickered, casting shadows that seemed almost reverent. Lemoyne stared at the samples, knowing that this discovery would change everything, not just science, but the very understanding of life itself. And somewhere beneath his fascination, a darker impulse took root, one that whispered of control, of experimentation, of boundaries pushed beyond morality, all in the name of understanding the impossible. Night settled over the Saint-Denis orphanage like a slow, suffocating shroud, and in the far wing Lemoyne prepared his chamber for experiments that blurred the line between science and something far older, far darker. The room smelled of wax, metal, and antiseptic, a sterile stage for acts that would make ordinary minds recoil. Candles lined the shelves and tables, their flickering flames reflecting off glass vials filled with Celeste's deep blue blood, the liquid catching the light like trapped moonlight. Instruments of measurement, thermometers, pressure gauges, tiny clamps of cold iron, were arranged with obsessive precision. Nothing was accidental. Every placement was calculated, every action rehearsed in his mind before it touched reality. Celeste remained at the center of this quiet storm, seated upon a wooden chair with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not protest when he adjusted her limbs, secured a tiny cold iron clamp to test circulation, or directed a small pulse of mechanical pressure against her wrist. She seemed to anticipate each stimulus, tilting her head, shifting slightly, her calm gaze suggesting a knowledge of the ritual that far exceeded her years. Lemoyne's actions, methodical and deliberate, were no longer mere observation. They had become a sequence, a quiet choreography in which Celeste played both subject and unspoken partner. He tested temperature responses, slowly increasing and decreasing heat on a small patch of skin, measuring reactions with instruments that whispered of cruelty. Each movement was recorded, charted, and illustrated in diagrams resembling occult symbols, yet justified under the guise of scientific rigor. The orphanage around them was silent, yet Lemoyne drew subtle energy from it. The presence of other children, awake or restless in nearby rooms, enhanced the atmosphere, adding a layer of tension he considered essential to the experiments. Their muffled cries, footsteps, and whispered fears created a living background to his work, a hum of emotion that he measured, recorded, and occasionally manipulated by the placement of shadows or the flicker of candlelight. He noted their responses to Celeste's calm demeanor, to the blue blood in the vials, to the small shocks of thermal and mechanical stimuli applied with absolute precision. He believed emotion amplified the phenomena he was studying, each heartbeat of fear or curiosity enhancing the subtle reactions he observed. Celeste's role in this ritual was silent but profound. She did not scream, flinch, or protest. Instead, she guided the experiments with minute gestures, a blink, a tilt of her shoulder, a slight pressure of her fingers. Lemoyne noticed these subtleties and began to integrate them into his methodology, treating her almost as a collaborator in the pursuit of discovery. At times, her influence seemed to direct the experiment itself. He would pause, adjust, or apply stimuli in response to the faintest of signals, as if she orchestrated the scene through a language invisible to the ordinary eye. The power imbalance was absolute, yet Celeste's calm dominance suggested a presence far beyond innocence. He experimented with sensory deprivation, light and shadow manipulation, and controlled pressure against nerve clusters, always recording reactions with mechanical instruments, meticulous notes, and diagrams that bordered on sacred geometry. Each session ended with careful collection of blood samples, which he stored in cooled vials, each labeled and annotated with exact times, temperature, and emotional context. He referred to the process as scientific ritual, but it carried the rhythm of ceremony, a quiet devotion to control, observation, and mastery of a life unlike any other. The line between study and devotion blurred, and Lemoyne barely noticed it himself, caught in the intensity of his own obsession. The other children, aware of these nightly patterns, grew uneasy, whispers circulating through dim corridors of the orphanage. Some dared not leave their beds, sensing that the shadows themselves watched Celeste, that the room at the far wing was a place where normal rules did not apply. Fear hung thick in the hallways, unspoken yet palpable, a living entity that strengthened the experiments without conscious intervention. Lemoyne considered this energy essential, a supplement to the blue blood's mystery and to Celeste's calm, enigmatic control. By dawn, Lemoyne would retreat to his quarters exhausted but satisfied. Candles burned low, instruments returned to their positions, vials safely stored, and Celeste returned to her cot, unmarked, untouched by the agony that had defined the night. He documented every detail in his notebooks, filling pages with diagrams, measurements, and cryptic notes that suggested both science and devotion, both experiment and ritual. The room seemed almost reverent in its silence, the candlelight reflecting the impossibility of what had occurred. A quiet stage for a child whose very blood defied understanding, and a man whose obsession was growing into something methodical, almost sacred and deeply terrifying. In this dark ballet, Lemoyne realized he was no longer merely observing. He was orchestrating life itself, conducting experiments that bent morality, nature, and logic into precise, ritualized form. The line between study and ceremony, between cruelty and discovery had vanished, leaving only the cold certainty of methodical obsession and the faint iridescent glow of blue blood still waiting for its secrets to be revealed. Marianne had worked at Saint-Denis for nearly 5 years, tending to the children with a quiet dedication that often went unnoticed. She knew the rhythms of the orphanage, the creak of the stairboards at night, the faint sighs behind closed doors, the whispers of children too timid to speak. But something about Celeste unsettled her from the moment the pale, bluish child arrived. Marianne could feel it in the way the animals recoiled, the way shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the girl's presence, and the way the children glanced at her with a mixture of awe and fear. Over weeks, Marianne began noticing patterns that the other staff dismissed. Trails of faint, dried blood that seemed to appear and vanish, objects subtly displaced, and a quiet order to the chaos surrounding Celeste. One night, determined to understand, she moved silently through the orphanage's corridors, following the faint glow of candlelight seeping under a locked door. Peeking inside, she saw Lemoyne hunched over tables of homo, instruments, vials, and charts, his movements precise and deliberate. Celeste sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of a metal tray, her eyes calm and unafraid, almost knowing. Marianne's stomach twisted as she recognized the instruments of cruelty. Cold clamps, delicate mechanical presses, small heaters used to test reactions, and she realized this was no ordinary medical study. She began taking note of the patterns, the timing, the ways Lemoyne's experiments seemed ritualized, almost ceremonial. The child's reactions, measured and silent, were recorded with obsessive precision. Marianne understood that Celeste was not just a passive subject. She was part of the system, aware, almost participating. Fear settled deep in her chest, but so did a grim resolve. She began keeping her own secret records, noting every experiment she could glimpse, every subtle manipulation of the children's emotions, every unnatural quiet that followed Lemoyne's night rituals. The horror of her discovery did not erupt in screams. It simmered in silence. Marianne realized that evil in Saint-Denis was not loud or chaotic. It was quiet, systematic, meticulous. And the child at the center, with her unnatural calm and unknowable blue blood, was both witness and agent, blurring the line between innocence and complicity. In that moment, Marianne understood the orphanage itself had become a laboratory of fear, a place where methodical cruelty had taken root and thrived in the shadows, hidden behind walls of discipline and decorum unseen by those who refused to look closely enough. By the time the remaining children had learned to speak in hushed tones, to move quietly in the hallways, and to avoid Celeste's penetrating gaze, the atmosphere in Saint-Denis had grown taut with fear. It was no longer only Lemoyne who imposed control. The pale, blue-blooded girl had begun to exert her own influence, subtle yet undeniable. She observed the other children with a detached patience, noting their reactions to whispers, glances, and sudden silences. A dropped toy, a shifted chair, a forgotten cup in the dining hall, all became instruments of her quiet orchestration. She did not strike, nor did she shout. Instead, she learned the precise moments when fear could be implanted, like a seed placed just beneath the soil. Emily, who had once been boisterous and confident, found herself trembling when Celeste was near, her small hands clutching the edges of her dress as if it could shield her from the invisible manipulations. Lucien, younger and more impressionable, refused to enter certain rooms at night, claiming shadows followed him, though no one else saw them. Sophie, quiet and thoughtful, would wake from sleep with her sheets tangled, murmuring about a pale girl standing at the foot of her bed, whispering warnings that made no sense. Marianne noticed these patterns, recording the children's reactions with growing horror. She realized that Celeste's influence was not accidental. The girl anticipated fears before they fully formed, nudging them into existence with the precision of an unseen hand. Celeste's strategies were almost surgical in their precision. She would isolate one child at a time, letting subtle threats fester in silence, and then watch as anxiety spread through the group, like ripples across stagnant water. No one could pinpoint the source. When an older orphan sought to comfort the frightened, Celeste would redirect attention, causing confusion and self-doubt. Lemoine's obsession with her blue blood continued, but he had begun to depend on her as an active participant. He no longer merely observed. He followed cues she provided, allowing the child to guide experiments that were increasingly cruel and emotionally manipulative. The orphanage had become a theater of fear, where each child's response was both subject and instrument, each reaction feeding the next layer of psychological control. Marianne's heart ached as she watched the slow erosion of innocence. The children were trapped in a web of unseen threats, their trust fractured, their courage hollowed. The horror was not in what Celeste physically did, but in the way she could predict and shape every emotion, every instinct without ever raising her hand. The orphanage's corridors, once simple passageways, now echoed with tension, the walls pressing in with the weight of constant surveillance, the air thick with unspoken dread. In the shadows, Lemoine smiled quietly, convinced that his experiments were reaching new heights, blind to the fact that the true architect of chaos was not him. Celeste, pale and observant, watched with a stillness that unsettled even the most composed staff. The line between victim and perpetrator had begun to blur. The game was no longer simply one of science or observation, but of power, fear, and the unnerving intelligence of a child who understood far more than she should. The morning had begun like any other at Saint-Denis, with the damp air heavy from the night's humidity, the smell of disinfectant lingering faintly over the worn wooden floors. But an uneasy tension had already settled over the orphanage, one that Marianne noticed immediately. Children whispered in corners, casting furtive glances at one another, avoiding Celeste's pale, penetrating gaze. She moved with deliberate calm, as if aware that the weight of unseen eyes followed her. Lemoine, as always, remained in the shadows of his workroom, cataloging observations, adjusting instruments, and noting minute reactions with methodical precision. The quiet chaos of fear that had been growing for months was about to escalate into something irreversible. It was Lucien who became the instrument of catastrophe, though no one, not even Celeste, seemed to recognize it at first. He had been unusually restless that morning, agitated by whispers, by the cold drafts that cut through the corridors, by the lingering scent of antiseptic that now seemed sharper, almost chemical in its edge. Lemoine, noticing the boy's heightened anxiety, saw an opportunity to test a new procedure, one he had designed to measure reactions to temperature and pressure combined. The instruments were arranged with deliberate care, small clamps designed to apply precise tension, shallow vessels of heated and cooled liquids, and fine needles to monitor minute physiological responses. To any observer, the setup might have appeared clinical, even scientific, but Marianne recognized it for what it was, a ritual of control disguised as medical inquiry. Lucien was guided into the room under the pretense of a routine examination. His movements were hesitant, his breath shallow and quick. Celeste followed silently, her eyes fixed on the boy, noting every flinch, every shift of weight. Marianne, hidden in the shadows, felt her stomach tighten as she watched, knowing that the delicate balance of curiosity, fear, and obedience was about to tip. Lemoyne began his measurements, applying heat, pressure, and monitoring reactions with meticulous care. Lucien's cries were quiet, stifled by the walls and the fear of reprimand. The boy struggled, his small body trembling against the instruments, but he did not scream. He had learned the rules, as all the children had, that the walls of Saint-Denis absorbed sound, leaving only silence as witness. Then it happened. A slight misalignment of one clamp, a fraction of a degree too much in the heated liquid, combined with the subtle pressure of a needle puncture, and Lucien's body convulsed. His pulse faltered, eyes widening with a sudden understanding of his own helplessness. Marianne could do nothing but watch, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized he was slipping beyond the edge of life. Celeste remained eerily calm, almost detached, as though she had been expecting this precise outcome. Lemoyne's reaction was equally controlled. He documented the event with the same cold precision he applied to every procedure, noting minute changes, heart rate, and the boy's final responses. There was no panic in the room, only the clinical acknowledgement of an outcome. By the time the staff discovered Lucien's body, Lemoyne had already crafted a narrative of accident. A slip, a misstep, a tragic combination of events. The children were hushed and herded into corners, whispering among themselves, aware that another had been taken in the shadows of Saint-Denis. Marianne, though, could not accept the explanation. She had seen the intent, the design, and the quiet, almost ritualistic orchestration that had led to Lucien's death. She began to document everything secretly, recording instruments, positions, temperatures, and Lemoyne's precise movements, understanding that these notes might be the only record of what had truly occurred. Celeste, still pale and quiet, observed the aftermath with a calm that unsettled even Marianne, a child who had begun to comprehend fear on a level that no other could. The balance of innocence and agency had shifted further. The orphanage was no longer merely a place of experimentation. It had become a chamber of methodical terror, where curiosity and control intersected with the unnatural intelligence of a child who seemed to understand far more than she should. The seeds of horror, sown quietly over months, had borne fruit, and there was no turning back. Marianne had not slept for nights, her mind haunted by the rhythm of Lemoyne's footsteps echoing down the orphanage halls, the faint metallic scent of blue blood lingering in the air, and the quiet, knowing gaze of Celeste as she moved among the remaining children. It was in the bowels of the orphanage, behind a false panel in Lemoyne's study, that she discovered the notebooks, bound in worn leather and meticulously annotated. The first pages appeared innocuous, observations of vital signs, diagrams of pulses and reactions, but as she turned them, the tone shifted subtly at first, then became chillingly clear. Every page revealed a mind slipping from scientific curiosity into obsession, every experiment calculated, every outcome measured with the precision of a craftsman and the cruelty of someone who had abandoned empathy. The notebooks described Celeste in ways no one else had dared. Her pulse, her cold extremities, the strange metallic hue of her blood, all meticulously recorded. Lemoyne's writing was methodical, clinical, yet beneath the surface the sentences carried a creeping reverence, almost devotion. He referred to her not as a child, but as a phenomenon, a subject for perfection, something to be refined, observed, and ultimately understood or possessed. He detailed each disappearance, the silent removal of children, the way they responded, the way fear altered their physiology, all catalogued as though emotion could be quantified and used as an instrument of study. Marianne's stomach turned as she realized that the deaths, the vanishings, the terror, all had been part of a larger design, one Lemoyne considered both scientific and ritualistic. The further Marianne read, the more disturbing the notebooks became. Lemoyne had begun to embed symbols, diagrams that resembled alchemical and occult markings alongside the physiological charts. He described placing Celeste's blood under varying conditions, heat, cold, pressure, and electrical stimuli, and noted subtle changes that no other scientist had ever observed. He theorized that her blood contained a form of life force beyond conventional understanding, something that might bend natural law if harnessed correctly. Each entry revealed a mind increasingly unhinged, moving from scientific observation to philosophical justification. He wrote of perfecting the vessel, of drawing out potential, and of the necessity of fear and silence in the experiments. Marianne read on, each page revealing the depth of the horrors she had only glimpsed in shadows. Lemoyne described the orphans not as children but as variables in a controlled environment, noting their terror and resilience with equal detachment. He described Celeste's role with an almost reverent clarity. She was not merely a subject, he claimed, but an agent of precision, guiding reactions subtly, a participant in the orchestration of the experiments. The realization that the child had been complicit, or at least aware, chilled Marianne to the bone. Evil had worn the guise of innocence, manipulating, observing, and participating in ways no one had suspected. The final pages contained plans, sketches of instruments, methods, and diagrams, as if Lemoyne had intended to continue indefinitely, expanding his experiments, perfecting his control. Marianne understood now the scope of what had occurred. Months of orchestrated terror, meticulous observation, and calculated deaths, all documented with painstaking care. The notebooks were more than evidence. They were a window into a mind that could rationalize cruelty as science, and a child who could exist simultaneously as victim and accomplice. The moral weight was unbearable, the psychological horror complete. She closed the notebooks slowly, pressing them to her chest, understanding that the truth could never be fully spoken aloud. The orphanage walls had witnessed atrocities that words could not contain, and the silence of the living, the surviving children, was as haunting as the evidence itself. Marianne resolved to protect what remained, to document quietly, and to bear witness to the horror that had unfolded. She had seen the machinery of obsession, the methodology of evil, and the way silence and innocence could conceal it. Celeste watched from the shadows as Marianne emerged from the hidden study, her expression calm, almost approving, as though the act of discovery had been anticipated. The child's eyes were mirrors of the notebooks themselves, calm, observant, and infinitely knowing. In that moment, Marianne understood that the true horror of Saint-Denis was not merely in the deaths or the vanished children, or even the blue blood that defied comprehension. but in the methodical, patient, and hidden nature of the evil that had been cultivated there. It was a confession in ink and paper, but also a confession of the world itself, that horror could exist quietly, deliberately, and without witness. The night air in Saint-Denis was thick with humidity, carrying the faint metallic tang of old disinfectant and the lingering odor of fear. The surviving children huddled in the dormitory, their small bodies pressed together as if proximity alone could ward off the unseen threats that had claimed their friends. Candles flickered against the peeling plaster walls, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move with intention, and the faint blue glow that sometimes emanated from Celeste's skin painted the room in an otherworldly hue. Lemoine, consumed by his obsession, had not noticed the pattern yet, but Marianne did. She watched the child, noting the unnatural calm with which she observed the room, the way she seemed to almost glide along the floor, silent and deliberate. It began with a low, almost imperceptible hum, a vibration that pulsed through the floorboards as if the house itself recognized the moment. One by one, the candles sputtered, their flames bowing to some invisible draft. The children stirred, unease rippling through them, a fear without sound, a terror without origin. Marianne's heart pounded. She had seen horrors before, but this was different. There was no Lemoine orchestrating tonight, no instruments, no measured observations. Only the quiet, deliberate disappearance of a presence. Celeste was at the center, her small frame illuminated by a faint luminescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. She moved toward the door as if guided by instinct or knowledge beyond human comprehension, her tiny hand grazing the handle without a sound. The other children did not cry out. They did not even watch. It was as if they understood something unspoken, some secret rule of the orphanage that dictated silence and stillness in moments of transcendence or terror. Marianne tried to intervene, her fingers trembling as she reached for the child, but a force, cold, intangible, impossible to resist, pressed against her chest, holding her back, rendering her powerless. The door swung open, slow and deliberate, and for a fleeting second Marianne saw the faintest outline of the courtyard beyond, bathed in the ghostly light of the moon. Celeste stepped into the space, a figure moving with purpose, and then she was gone. No sound, no struggle, no trace beyond the residual blue glow that lingered like smoke in the corners of the room. The children stared at the empty doorway, their faces pale, lips quivering, but no tears fell. They knew that this was not a typical absence, that whatever had taken her had done so with intention, with design, and with a subtle understanding of the world that the living could not hope to grasp. Lemoine arrived moments later, alerted by a faint alarm in the back of his mind, the kind only obsession can produce. He paused at the doorway, eyes wide, the weight of his own failure pressing down upon him in a way no experiment, no notebook, no measurement had ever conveyed. The meticulous observations, the rituals, the charts, none of it could account for this disappearance. He searched the orphanage room by room, floor by floor, but Celeste had vanished as if she had never been there at all. The children watched silently, their small bodies pressed to the corners, aware that the absence of the child they had known was the beginning of a new, unspoken terror. Marianne recorded every detail in her mind, every nuance, every impossible aspect of the event. There was no sign of struggle, no window forced open, no lock broken. The aura of the child seemed to linger, a faint blue shimmer in the corners, a memory pressed into the very walls of Saint-Denis. Lemoine, for the first time, was confronted with the limits of his control, his obsession unraveling before his eyes. He understood that the object of his study had transcended his instruments, his rituals, and his reason. The surviving children whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible, speaking of a shadow girl who walked between the world of the living and something else entirely. Marianne listened, noting the consistency of their accounts, and realized that this was not mere imagination. The child had become a phenomenon beyond comprehension, leaving behind a space heavy with absence, dread, and awe. The orphanage was changed irrevocably, its atmosphere permanently haunted by the presence of the one who had been there and was now nowhere. Lemoine remained in the room long after the disappearance, staring at the doorway as if willing Celeste to return, tracing diagrams in the air with trembling fingers, murmuring equations that no longer mattered. Marianne understood that the true horror of Saint-Denis was now complete. The experiments, the deaths, and the blue blood were no longer contained within mortal comprehension. The silence of the orphanage, the unbroken gaze of the surviving children, and the vanished figure of Celeste combined to create a haunting certainty. Evil had acted methodically, quietly, and without human reckoning, leaving only questions, fear, and a lingering, luminescent memory of what could not be understood. The dawn after Celeste's disappearance did not bring relief, but a suffocating weight that pressed upon Saint-Denis like a living thing. The surviving children sat silently in the dining hall, their eyes hollow, fingers gripping one another as if contact alone could prevent them from being swallowed by the lingering dread. Staff moved with mechanical precision, carrying trays of tepid food, whispering among themselves, afraid that the wrong sound might break the fragile barrier between normalcy and chaos. Marianne paced the corridors, recording every detail in her mind, haunted by the memory of blue light, impossible doors, and a child who had vanished without a trace. The orphanage was irrevocably changed. The walls seemed to close in, and the air smelled permanently of antiseptic, iron, and a tension that refused to dissipate. Authorities arrived within days, summoned by the persistent rumors that could no longer be contained. Inspectors, doctors, and local officials swept through the decaying halls, notebooks and instruments in hand. But their rational eyes failed them. The blood of the missing children had dried into faint, almost invisible stains. Impossible to trace. Doors and windows were intact, locks unbroken. Marianne guided the officials to every corner, every creaking floorboard. Yet even she could not offer explanation, only witness and observation. They questioned Lemoine, whose obsession had only deepened, whose careful detachment had been replaced by fevered, desperate explanations that failed to account for absence, for blue blood, for the meticulous suffering of the children. The man's notebooks were examined, revealing diagrams, experimental notes, and ritual-like annotations, but they offered only fragmented insight into a mind that had operated beyond the bounds of morality and increasingly beyond ordinary science. The surviving orphans were interviewed, their voices small and uneven, recounting whispers, shadows, and a luminescent girl who had been at the center of fear and fascination. Their testimony was dismissed by some as hysteria, the imaginings of traumatized children, but Marianne persisted. She documented each detail, each pattern, convinced that the events were neither coincidence nor imagination. Even the blue blood, the metallic hue that had defied analysis, that had inspired Lemoyne's darkest obsessions, was noted in careful, meticulous reports, though scientists shrugged and labeled it a chemical anomaly, a natural aberration, or the result of trauma. Yet some among them shivered, sensing that reason was insufficient, that the world had shifted in that small orphanage where methodical evil had taken root. Lemoyne, confronted by the authorities and by the collapse of his life's work, became increasingly withdrawn. He refused to leave the premises, wandering the halls, touching floorboards, and whispering to the empty air as though the missing children or Celeste herself might return. His obsession had transformed into a kind of madness, his mind replaying sequences of experiments, diagrams, and calculations. No rational argument could reach him. His science had been an excuse for control, for engagement with life and death in ways society could not condone, and now even that engagement was denied him. Marianne watched him, noting the eerie symmetry of his despair. A man undone not by punishment but by the impossibility of containing what he had unleashed. Public outrage spread slowly but steadily. Rumors of blue-blooded children, vanished orphans, and a physician's obsession filtered through the city, reaching newspapers and scientific circles. Investigators recommended sweeping reforms, and the state of Louisiana responded with stricter oversight for orphanages, new protocols for child welfare, and penalties for unchecked authority. Yet despite new regulations, the story persisted in whispered tones, a cautionary tale of how evil can operate quietly under the guise of normalcy, science, and care. The orphanage itself remained, its walls scarred by memory, its corridors haunted by the children who had survived and those who had vanished. Visitors spoke of the oppressive air, of strange shadows at the edge of vision, and of the faintest glimmer of blue that lingered in corners long after it should have faded. Marianne remained with the children for months, documenting, protecting, and attempting to restore what little stability remained. She understood better than anyone that the evil which had operated in silence was not gone, only hidden, waiting for conditions to allow it to resurface. In private, scientists debated the impossibility of blue blood, the limits of physiology, and the unseen forces that might explain Celeste's disappearance. Philosophers and theologians mused on the nature of morality, the quiet persistence of cruelty, and the way innocence could mask malevolence. In the hushed corridors of Saint-Denis, history and memory intertwined with fear and fascination, creating a legacy that could not be erased. The orphanage had become a symbol, a warning, a place where science, obsession, and innocence intersected to produce results that defied comprehension, leaving society to grapple with questions that had no answers. Years passed, and Saint-Denis orphanage was shuttered, its windows boarded and its doors chained, yet the memory of what occurred within its walls refused to fade. Scholars debated the blue blood, theorists argued over Lemoyne's obsessive methods, and townsfolk told hushed stories of a pale girl who had vanished in the night, leaving behind only whispers and dread. Marianne, now older, carried the weight of her memories like a permanent scar, keeping detailed accounts of what she had witnessed, the evidence she had documented. and the faces of children who would never know safety or joy. She understood that the orphanage's horrors had left an indelible mark, not just on the survivors but on the community, the science that had failed to predict it, and the law that had moved too slowly to protect the vulnerable. Memorials were erected, small plaques commemorating the lives lost, the nameless victims whose disappearances had been recorded in blood and silence. Laws changed, mandating inspections, proper documentation, and oversight of institutions housing children. Yet the questions lingered. How had a child like Celeste appeared, seemingly ordinary, yet harboring a physiology beyond comprehension? How had Lemoine, a man trusted by his peers, transformed fascination into methodical cruelty without detection for so long? And most chillingly, what had become of the girl with blue blood who had walked away from it all, leaving her mark only in absence? The surviving orphans grew into adulthood carrying the trauma within them, the details of which they could never fully share. Nightmares of shadows and glowing light haunted their sleep, and the sense of being observed, of being measured and manipulated, never entirely vanished. Psychologists who studied the case noted the precision of Lemoine's methods, the ritualistic layering of control and fear, and the eerie calm with which Celeste had approached her own study. There was no precedent for a mind so methodical, so quietly cruel, nor for a child whose very body had become an object of obsession and terror. Speculation about Celeste persisted. Some believed she had been taken by forces beyond the natural, that her physiology had allowed her to escape in ways ordinary children could not. Others theorized she had remained hidden in society, unnoticed yet influencing events subtly, a living reminder of what happens when innocence masks unimaginable danger. Her legacy, like the blue hue of her blood, could not be explained, only felt, a lingering presence, a question without an answer, a warning to those who might overlook the quiet patterns of evil. Philosophers reflected on the case in journals and lectures, emphasizing the quiet persistence of malevolence. Evil, they argued, rarely shouts. It creeps, observes, and works in plain sight. Institutions, no matter how venerable, are vulnerable to minds that operate with precision, patience, and detachment. The story of Saint-Denis became a cautionary tale, a reminder that cruelty can be methodical, hidden, and patient, waiting for opportunity to entwine itself with trust, care, and authority. In the end, the blue-blooded girl became legend, her existence a question mark that challenged reason, morality, and science alike. The orphanage, the experiments, the vanished children, all became a symbol of silence, of evil hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. And in the quietest hours, when shadows stretch long and candlelight trembles, the question lingers. What do you think? Could this happen again?